Ukraine grain exports are currently limited to 500 tons a month, down from as much as 5 million tons before the war. Megan, thanks so much for being here. For anybody who hasn't seen your story, they should definitely take a look at it. But first off, I want to just start with this number here, 500 tons a month. How is grain even being exported from Ukraine right now? I mean, we're taking a look at some of the images from the country. I mean, how is anything getting out?
Sure. So, in a normal situation, Ukraine's grain would make its way from the production areas down to the ports in the Black Sea, where it's loaded on big cargo ships bound for customers in Asia, Europe, elsewhere. Right now, it's mostly getting out by rail. So that means the railways are loading grain and it's headed westward. But that's not a normal route for to be taking. It's going quite slow. It's more expensive. One of the big choke points is the Ukrainian railways are a different size than those in the EU where they're reaching. So it causes a lot of complications at the border. So some grain is still getting out that way. It's headed to neighboring nations like Romania, but it is slow going, to say the least.
I mean, how big of a problem, if you can, Megan, just for a minute, dig into some of those issues? You mentioned railway. I mean, is this a solution maybe that was in the making, or is this really an issue considering how expensive and sort of the other hurdles that you just mentioned to be sort of a stopgap while this war continues?
Yeah, so it's probably more of a stopgap solution for now. When you think about the type of ships that would usually be transporting grain from the ports, they can handle much larger volumes than a rail car can. So it's just much more efficient to do it that way. But they really don't have that option right now. So railways is kind of the best path forward. I think there's also some grain being transited by road, but again, that's pretty small volumes. So yeah, this is kind of the path they're looking at for the time being.
And so then, what other countries are stepping in as the result, Megan?
Yeah, so when you think about Ukraine, they are one of the world's biggest wheat, corn, sunflower oil exporters, pretty vital to the world's agricultural supply chain. With their ports closed for the time being, we're seeing a country like India become a much bigger player on the global wheat stage. India, traditionally isn't a big exporter. It has these high government set crop prices that typically keep most of its harvests at home. But given how much global prices have rallied, they're really stepping up and shipping record volumes all across Asia. On the import side, we're seeing some unusual flows as well. For example, Spain and China, which are typically big buyers of Ukrainian corn at this time of year, are stepping up purchases from the U.S. instead. I think the U.S. is shipping corn to Spain for the first time in something like 4 years.
How unusual is this?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty unusual to see one of the world's biggest grain players shut off from the markets essentially overnight. There's also some questions about how Russia's crops will be handled going forward. Grain from Russia is still flowing. It shipped, more than 1 million tons of wheat abroad in March. But the big questions will come around mid-year. That's when both Ukraine and Russia will be harvesting their next grain crops. And exports are usually peak around that time, especially for a crop like wheat. So will they be able to do that? And especially for Ukraine, how much will they be able to grow, let alone sell?
Yeah, and what about, Megan, when it comes to pricing? I mean, is all of this going to eventually fall directly on the consumer? Are we seeing that already happen? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so, when you look at just the grain futures, so the commodity prices, corn and wheat are both up more than 20% since the start of the year. We saw wheat touch a record last month. Corn's been near multi-year highs as well. And food inflation already had been accelerating before this war even erupted. There's been some harvest setbacks around the world, some supply chain snarls, things like that, all feeding into this. Demand had also been kind of rebounding after the pandemic. We are already seeing some impacts on prices. Here in Europe, for example, there's already been some warnings about shortages of sunflower oil. Ukraine's such a big supplier of sunflower oil that it's hard to get it from elsewhere. In Egypt as well, the prices of some of their unsubsidized bread had already been rising in the wake of the war.
And Megan, what I thought was really interesting about your story too is that there's a lot of trickle-down effects that maybe we aren't even thinking of, considering this global trade the issue that's happening right now. Can you just walk us through a few of those? I know you mentioned pig farmers might start to feel the effects of this. Where else are you seeing this maybe a longer-term issue for people who maybe this isn't even on their radar right now?
Yeah, so when you're talking about the pig farmers, so here in Europe, the EU is quite a large buyer of Ukrainian corn. Corn is usually fed to all the world's livestock herds, so they're certainly feeling the pinch right now. I believe we had a comment from an Italian group that was saying that farmers there are already having to cull some of their dairy cows, which is quite a sudden impact in the midst of all of this. So that's something certainly that we're keeping an eye on. And, this just kind of heightens the focus as well on what the weather will look like across the Northern Hemisphere for the next few months. Farmers in the US, here in Europe, are starting to plant the next crop, so all of that will have a bigger bearing than usual on global supplies going forward.
How do you see this when you talk about going forward? How do you see this global trade shakeup that's happening right now playing out the rest of the year? I mean, are we going to start seeing countries really sort of hold on to some of their own imports or some of the grains that they're growing? What is the concern here, or is this maybe opening up an opportunity for some of these other players, like you mentioned, to step in and to start trading?
Yeah, so it's kind of a mix of both. We spoke to a Rabobank analyst who is saying, in times of high prices, not only do you see more exporters emerge, some of these kind of unusual players, as we've mentioned, but it also raises the risk of protectionism. So that's, like you said, countries that are trying to hold on to their own supply, make sure they can ensure local food security. So we've seen examples of this already. Serbia, which is I think something like the 9th largest corn exporter, has temporarily banned sales abroad. Countries like Argentina and Indonesia have raised export taxes on products like soybean oil and palm oil. So those are products that are becoming more in demand with Ukraine's sunflower oil out of the market. And yesterday we saw Kazakhstan as well say that it was going to be limiting some wheat and I believe flour exports for the time being. So, when some of those moves can be incremental on their own, but when you take everything together, it just kind of adds to all of the supply chain hurdles that the world is facing right now, particularly for agricultural importers.